So I thought I would start off, I know we're all a little bit tired, so maybe let's start off with a little exercise in the morning. Everybody who's using Lucene, please stand up. All right. Okay, now all of you guys sit down. If you're using Solar, please stand up. All right, very good, very good. Always good to see a good mix of use between Lucene and Solar. One last question, and this is one I think for me often frames the discussion that I like to think around search and then as it relates to big data, and really the tagline that I have there, it's still all about the user. How many of you know what the top queries are on your website? You could just off the top of your head, if a business person came to you and said, these are our top 10 queries, these are the way we make our money, how many of you could answer that question without hesitation? A handful. All right, this is getting better. You guys are listening. In the last few years when I asked this question, there's maybe one or two, and now there's a handful. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is, we've heard a lot about big data, and we've heard obviously a lot about Lucene and Solar. I would put forth there that I want to make sure that you guys still have in your head that it's still all about the user. And that question that I just asked you is really fundamental to making sure that you have successful search and that you're successfully using all of that data that we're all so excited about. Because I think, as engineers, it's all very exciting to talk about Hadoop and all of these great things and having, 5,000 node cluster. But at the end of the day, if you're not still focused on what your user's doing, if you have no insight into that, you're not going to be producing the best possible search results that you want to. So the way I like to think about this is kind of just taking a step back and thinking about the promise and reality of big data. And I thought I would start off with a couple of quotes. This first one is from a paper put out called The 6 Provocations for Big Data. And data is increasingly digital air is the position of this paper. So, everybody taking a big deep breath. Can you taste that air? Can you smell the data? That's what we're talking about right here, right? And I think especially the last line is interesting. It's both sustenance and pollution. So just like our regular air, we have to have it in order to live. We have to have it in order to stay in business. But it also can cause a lot of problems if we're not being smart about how we use it. And that's really, at the end of the day, what all of these tools that get all of us geeks all excited about big data and lots of nodes and search and all of that is we have to know how to use it. And in fact, one of the people that I really admire in this space is Hilary Mason. She's the chief scientist over at Bitly. And if you saw her recent Strata talk, she said simply, the truth is I spend most of my time trying to reduce the size of my data so it can be analyzed. Now, there's a couple of subtleties in that, right? The whole notion of reduction implies that she's kept and has all of this big data to use, and then she has to go through and do some work to actually reduce it down. Okay? So if you don't keep it in the first place, you can't then go through the process of reducing it. But I think this is also part of the key of how we handle this big data stuff is you still have to do this work of thinking about what parts of it actually give me any tangible benefit. Just like even when you had small data or very little data at all, you still had to look at that and figure out what is it about it that makes this interesting. If I'm doing a user study of just 10 people, I still have to somehow figure out what of those 10 people is interesting, and then therefore I can extrapolate from to make interesting decisions in my business. With big data, it's still that same thing. You have all of this data. You now need to figure out what parts of it and how you can slice and dice it in such a way that is interesting. And this has always been hard, right? I mean, data analysis is always hard. It's very easy to make wrong conclusions from data. So what I always like to think about is let's be pragmatic about it. I think this is one of the things that I've had beaten into me over the years from being a committer in Lucene and Solar and other open source projects is really focus on the practical sides of this. It's easy to get all excited about all these technologies and think, oh wow, as an engineer this is really great, I can go off and do all of these things, but at the end of the day, the real question is how does that data help you satisfy your users' needs? All of these people aren't you. You guys are all the technical people, you know how all of this stuff works. What do these guys need to know? And what can you surface to them to make their lives better? more interesting, find their results better, all of that. And then really the other challenge that comes along with the big data side of it is how fast can you do that at scale, right? So that's really another part of this. Once I have all of this, how can I effectively do it such that I can make decisions more rapidly than my competitors, et cetera, et cetera. So taking a step back, I always like to, I think one of the things, if you've been in the search space long enough, you kind of have gone through this process, but I thought I would outline it a little bit more here. In the early days, 70s, 60s, Sultan came along and said, you know, we've got all of these documents, and we spent a lot of time essentially building out models around our document. You've got your vector space model and your language model and probabilistic models, et cetera, et cetera. And you did a whole lot of work around feature selection of those documents. And this is really what really started the drive towards search capabilities. And then after that, we started to look into queries, and we started looking at phrases and doing advanced queries. And you could go to the conferences like the Trek conference or any of these evaluation conferences, and if anybody's participated in that, you've spent a lot of time tuning your queries to try to figure out how best to use queries to then find the appropriate documents. And you've done the same on your own search applications, on your own website, et cetera. And then Google came along and a few others and said, okay, all of those documents are great and all those queries are great. Let's add into here relationships between documents. So we had things like PageRank and link authority and all of those things. And this was all good too, right? You know, now we have a system like Google where you can more or less have people vote on things, and we've extracted all of those relationships, and now we have better search from that. I think the more interesting thing now, though, is we're seeing evolve with all of this big data stuff and with more advanced search techniques is we've gone beyond just content relationships, and now you're starting to see a lot more focus on how are users actually interacting with all of this data, right? So in the beginning you had data and queries, and then maybe you had some relationships between that data. Now we're really at the point we have the tools where we can say, how are users interacting with all of that? What are they doing when they search, when they click on a link, et cetera, et cetera? What are they doing as it relates to their peers? We can even see some of the more advanced search techniques around learning the ranking functions for search. And so I would argue that really this intersection here is where you want to be as a search application developer. At Lucid, this is where we often see our most advanced customers. This is where they're coming to us and asking, okay, you know, I've got documents and I've got queries and maybe I'm doing some of that stuff, but they're looking to be into that intersection, and that's really where a lot of the cutting edge capabilities are and where they're looking to take things to the next level, if you will. So with that, I would put forth the way I like to think about how to do that intersection. This really is nothing new for many people, but you know, we've got search. The other part of search that often goes together is the discovery phase, so things like facets, et cetera. I'll talk more about all of these. And then I would say maybe the missing piece or the third part of that three-legged stool is the analytics side. I think we've done an okay job in open source and Lucene and Solar about talking about analytics, but what I would like to put forth here today is that we actually need to make this all much more integrated and easy to use and easy to consume for people, because I think a lot of you are building, especially this piece out here by yourself and on your own, but there's really a lot of goodness in there that we could abstract out and put in open source and bring out and make it easier for everybody to then go to that next level. And I think the interesting thing here too is this creates a virtuous cycle between all of these. When you have better analytics, you can then have better search and discovery, and then the more better search and discovery you have, then that feeds your analytics as well. And what we've seen with a number of customers really in thinking about the benefits of such a system is you really have, you know, it's all the things, all the goodness that you would come to expect out of good search system. You have better relevance, better conversion on your website. Users are finding what they need, they're buying it, et cetera. With the discovery aspects, you also have this serendipity, I didn't really know that was in my collection. That's really useful. This relates to something else that I'm doing. Therefore, I can then, I have some deeper insight to the way I'm doing things, and I can take that and run with it in my business. And of course, you can do this better and faster than you could in the past. From the business side, I think it's also interesting is that obviously you start to see more of a return on your investment in terms of search. You also see this awareness across your organization. When you bring those analytics in, and I'll talk more later about this analytics, you'll have more insight into what is going on in the organization. And for you guys who are all stood up and are developers, this actually makes your life easier. Because I can guarantee you, I've talked to many of you, you've all been in the room, and it gets a little bit uncomfortable when some C-level person or a VP or whatever says, how come this isn't working on search? Or, this particular query that I did is broken. Why don't you go fix it? And then you're like, okay, I'll go look into it. And if you have this information about what is working on your site and what not, and what is not, and you've done this analysis up front, that whole conversation gets a whole lot easier because you can just say, oh, well, here's the statistics. That query is ranked, 10,000 out of 11,000 in our query logs. It's really not that important. I can go tweak it if you want, but on the grand scheme of things, that's not a big deal. That just happens to be your pet peeve query. Or you can say, yes, that's our #1 query. I better go do something about it. And then finally, I think one of the most interesting things out of all of this is you get this agility. You get this ability to react much faster than you ever could before. And it's kind of an irony in there, right, is this fact that as I make the problem bigger, I'm actually able to be more agile, right? Because you have more real insight into what is going on, right? So a little bit on some of the needs that you have. Obviously, this is a very short list. You don't want to overwhelm you with bullets and all that thing. But in order to build out this search discovery analytics, or as I like to shorten to, just simply SDA, obviously you need fast, efficient, scalable search. I think maybe some of you guys have heard of some tools that might help you there. Large-scale, cost-effective storage. I think you'll hear in our next talk, Eric from Hortonworks, I think many of you probably have heard of Hadoop. That can be helpful there. You also need processing power. You need to be able to do large-scale distributed computation across that whole data set. But you also, I think, these days need to be able to do this kind of real-time capabilities too, that you have, where you constantly have this fire hose coming in, and you want to look at very short-term, interesting things. And then the Mahout person in me says, I really need this ability to learn from it too, and I don't just mean you personally need to be able to learn. You need machine learning and things like artificial intelligence, et cetera, that can help you deal with the vast volumes of data that you have, so that you can, because there's no way you're going to be able to personally deal with it all. And then the last bullet item there really is a mindset, I think, and it goes back to this notion of always be testing, or this willingness to ask questions, that you have to be willing to ask questions of your data. Think about just simply be able to say what if, and then provide the tools that allow your business to ask those questions and your users to ask those questions, right? So I think there's good news in all of this. I think we're all here because we've been doing open source for a while. We've got Lucene and Solar. There's people here aware of Hadoop, Mahout, all of that stuff. I actually believe, and this is the nice thing about where we're at, is you can do all of this with an open stack, and you can take in some of these tools and combine them together and build this all out, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. The other interesting thing I say is I think, and I'll highlight it also in the coming slides, is there's a number of people talking here throughout the next 2 days who can help you understand and get pieces of this such that you can start to fit together all of the pieces of this puzzle. So thinking about the search side, I mean, I think we know all of these things, but starting with good scalable search, I think Lucene and Solar, and that ecosystem has some of the best out there. I'll put it up against any of the proprietary vendors any day of the week, especially in terms of the way it compresses the index, the way it scales out when you build it out, the way it does relevance. You also, of course, need good relevance capabilities. For those of you who do not follow Trunk, you're going to hear a lot around Trunk and 4.0 over the coming 2 days. There's a lot of good talks on that. As somebody who has been in academia for a while doing research in this space, it's really exciting to me to see some of these capabilities coming forth. In particular, this pluggable scoring models, pluggable indexing models, being able to swap in and out different compression techniques for the index depending on your business needs. All of these things, I think, help you then get better relevance, better speed, better et cetera, out of your search capabilities. And then last but not least, in Trunk as well, some of the near real-time stuff that's coming, and you'll hear Michael talk about that tomorrow. This ability to have timely information available to you really at your fingertips makes for quite a bit of a game changer. No more waiting 15, an hour, 15 minutes, even 5 minutes for your index to update and you switch over to that new set of documents. So some pretty interesting and exciting capabilities coming there. If we look a little bit more on just quickly on the discovery side, I think you're starting to see some real practical applications coming out of discovery now. For a long time, I think discovery was always kind of treated as, oh, well, that's something you do if you've got maybe a science project or maybe you're creating some interesting visualizations for internal use. But I think now you're starting to see much more practical uses for discovery tools. And this is where I think a lot of times what you need to think about here is how can I help my user who doesn't really know what they're looking for, right? So things like, of course, like auto-suggest spelling, more like this, are all good. But you're also seeing things like related searches, search trails, and more interesting visualizations. One of my favorite visualization tools is Caret Squared. That can be very useful for looking at your whole collection and maybe understanding some of those things better. Mahout also has a number of capabilities around those. Real quickly, just search trails is essentially this notion that users who have come here before have left a trail of how they've gone through this query. You know, this user typed in this query and then went to this path and then down this path. They clicked on these 5 pages. Starting to see some interesting studies of people actually surfacing that information in their search engine, such that people can then just say, oh, well, this is what 10,000 users did prior to me, and here's where they led when they went to this query, which can be interesting if you can hook that in right. So those are things I think that we all already kind of understand. We've been doing that a fair amount with Lucene and Solar, and we fairly well understand that. We know some things work and some things don't. But I think analytics, as I mentioned earlier, is a bit of new territory for us. Especially you're starting to see more and more jobs around, hey, I'm looking for a data scientist. That's essentially what this stuff is getting at. What am I going to do with all of this data? And I really look at it as it's the other piece of the puzzle here. But for me, it's, again, going back to that pragmatism, I've seen a lot of people who take and make these nice, pretty visualizations for talks they're giving, et cetera. Or they, when you read a lot of the online material, you see all these nice infographics. I like to still go back to being a little bit more practical. I want to think about what analytics can do for me in making my search and discovery capabilities better, because I think that's really where you start to see the benefit. Now, it's fun to do the pretty presentations, but practically speaking, what we want is this deep capability that's embedded into our application, and it's your job as developers to make that happen. So thinking a bit more about analytics, I like to break it down into 2 different areas, one focused on end users and one focused on your internal users, because I think you do have, as developers, you always have at least those 2 constituencies in the way you're building these out. End users being those people who are consuming your product, the internal users, anybody in your business, including the development team, et cetera. And I also like to think about, we do some of these things online, we do some of these things offline in batch processing, and there's various tools that will help us with each of these. Some of these things can be done in real time or offline, so don't take this as gospel as to this is the only way it can be done. But analytics for end users, things like doing popularity click analysis. How many people here are doing click analysis in there already? Okay. So a few. So starting to think about, keeping all of your logs or keeping a pretty long a pretty deep set of your logs so that you can start to do that. We at LucidWorks actually have this, or at Lucid actually have this built into our LucidWorks. Doing link analysis, basically looking at all of those content relationships. These are all things that are traditionally built offline. Hadoop is a great tool for using these. The search trails, I talked a little bit. Anybody doing recommendations as well? So we've got a few there again. This notion that it's not necessarily about the content, but what has everybody else done when they've clicked on things? Can I then surface those as recommendations? It's not even necessarily keyword-based or query-based. It's just all driven by what people have clicked on in the pack. And then things like spell checking, collocations, NLP, a lot of that stuff can be done up front. Mahout and Hadoop and a lot of these other tools will usually be quite helpful for you here. And then on the online side, of course, sometimes it can be interesting in your applications to start surfacing things to users that can help them find what they're looking for. So trends, particularly if you're doing real-time search on, say, news or something where it's constantly coming in, or on social media, being able to surface those trends in real time is pretty important. So you're starting to see what are people doing, essentially, is the first question. The second question is who are they doing that stuff with? And then the last one, the location, where are they doing that? Being able to do that all in real time makes for a pretty compelling, it can make for a pretty compelling and interesting use of analytics that can have real power in your site. And of course, there's starting to be some interesting new projects coming out here in terms of this whole real-time analysis. The Storm project from Twitter, S4 is recently into the Apache Incubator, really designed, APIs designed from the ground up to deal with that steady stream of content coming in. So you can start to see, okay, I can leverage these tools together in order to produce better results for my users. For the internal users, it's really about giving people insight into what's going on in your system. Some of the offline things here, again, I asked that question, how many people can list out their top 10 queries? So that's the top X. Another interesting one, how many people have looked at what queries are producing 0 results in your system? I mean, that's another area where I think if you're noticing a lot of 0 results, then you've got something wrong, perhaps. Or maybe it's just this particular, you need to think about if you're seeing a lot of 0 results, what ways can I give, what other things can I do for users in those situations such that they might then find the things that they're looking for. There was a really interesting paper from eBay and SIG-IR from this year. They did a whole pretty large analysis of all of their 0 results. Had some pretty interesting conclusions. I would encourage you all to go read that paper. Other things like mean reciprocal rank and mean average precision. Where in the result lists are people actually clicking on things, such that you can then understand, hey, are users for these queries, is this routinely page 2 stuff, page 3 stuff, or is it in the top? And depending on the types of queries, that may or may not be a good thing. But the fact that you now have some of this information can make for a better and more compelling search situation. And of course, with those, you're really just estimating it based off of either clicks from users, or you have some internal relevance analysis that your business people are doing for you. Things like user segmentation, seeing if I can slice up these users into different categories. Are these power users? Are they novice users? How do those 2 different users interact in my system? And then, of course, the last one there, this ad hoc analysis, I think this is really where the power of some of these tools like Pig and Hive and Hadoop and LucidWorks, et cetera, give you this nice, interesting ability to ask questions of your data however you dream up of them. It was interesting. I was talking to somebody in a few weeks ago at the Hadoop users group meeting that I organized in Raleigh, and his comment there was like, in the old days, if you remember, if you wanted to ask questions of your data, what did you do? Well, you went to your DBA and you said, hey, I would like to ask this question of my data, and then you waited 6 months for the schema to get changed in your data, and then you ran your queries and you found out that, oh, it didn't quite give you what you wanted, so then you went back to your DBA and said, could you make this change to the schema? And 6 months later, you gave up, right? Whereas now, with tools like this, you can just throw all that stuff into HDFS and run MapReduce over it, or use Pig or Hive or any of those, and just start asking ad hoc queries from it. And it really, that gets you back to that agility point, right? Is you now have that ability to now just arbitrarily ask any types of questions. So if your business user comes to you as a developer and say, hey, I want to ask this question, you say, oh, well, here's this great tool, Pig. I've loaded in all of the data into there, and then you can just start asking questions that way, right? Some of the online things to think about, I guess, trends, not a whole lot. Maybe you guys have some input into this later. I'd love to discuss it with you. But really, I think for internal users, it's all about the operational side of the stuff when it comes to online. What are people doing? How fast do they do it? Are there any problems in the system, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also some interesting tools available there. I think Giraffe is a pretty interesting one. The Spark project. HBase also, so you can start to think about, you can take all this data and you can pre-compute everything and then store it into something like HBase. That can also be useful. So of course, not everything's sunshine and rainbows in this world that I'm creating here. We do have some real work to do, I guess. A lot of the nice thing is a lot of it's done, and a lot of this stuff works on its own. You can go get Pig, you can go get Hadoop, you can go get Lucene, and you can make all those work. Naturally, one of the things I think we need to do is provide all of the glue. There's already some glue out there. For instance, I've done Mahout to Lucene into Mahout. That's pretty straightforward. I've seen some people online do Lucene indexes and Lucene logs or Solar logs into Pig and other tools like that, Hive, etc. I think the integration back into those tools still needs some work to do. Things like hooking in Mahout's classifiers or Mahout's recommendation system, et cetera, back into Lucene and Solar. And then, of course, things that make it easier to get your logs into those, especially if they're in the format from Solar or whatever your system's using. All of those things is kind of where I see there being a lot of work that we need to do, and it really is just glue work. So it shouldn't be too hard. But again, I would put out there for the community, I think this would be valuable for both the uptake of Lucene and Solar as well as just making your job easier. It's also, I think, interesting to start to think about, well, all of this stuff requires that I export data into some other container or some other system. What are things that we could start as Lucene and Solar users put into functionality in Lucene or Solar that makes life easier? For some of you who have used Solar already, there's things like the stats component, and you can use function queries. And that gives you some basic capabilities around doing and understanding in real time or near real time what is happening in your index. But what if you could start to do more aggregations across all your documents? Essentially function queries give you a per document function. What if you could start to aggregate information such that you could put in a query and then have some downstream analysis or analysis of that right as you've got that document set, go do these aggregations, figure out like the counts of terms and co-occurrences and all of those things right on the fly on those document sets. I think that makes for an interesting thing. And then, supporting that basically is having arbitrary stats capabilities across it, or maybe even arbitrary scripting capabilities. And then I think in trunk now we have some basic join capabilities, things like field collapsing as well as regular joins. Could we do more complex joins in the system? I think one of the things that Lucene and Solar have been good about is I think we've been taking in more database-like functionality quite well and giving people a lot of, people want to be able to do that kind of relational stuff in the index as well as have all of the capabilities of a good search engine. And I think we've been very pragmatic about getting that in and making that useful for people. So with that, I'll kind of leave you with a couple of thoughts, and we'll get on and introduce Eric. One of the things I like about this quote and thinking about what's next is really for you guys to think about what can I do to make all of this information available to my business and to my users. And I really like this quote from Brad Stevens, a basketball coach in the United States. I'm not usually big on sports quotes and all of that, but this one I think is not your typical kind of sports quote, right? This notion that Brad Stevens, if you don't know, Butler University is this kind of perennial underdog college basketball program that in recent years has been to the college Final Four, essentially the culmination of the college season. And the interesting thing is he basically takes the players that are kind of a little bit lower than the top tier Division I college players, and he uses a lot of data about how teams perform and how they play against Butler and how good his players are, how good are they at shooting, how good are they at defending, etc. And he uses that data to then make his team better. And the interesting thing here, and I think this applies to all of you too, is how do I get that data into their minds? How is this stuff instinctual? So next year when I come and we talk, and I want to see everybody raising their hand when they say they know what their top queries are, because if you don't know what your users are doing on your site, that data is not in your mind, and you don't really understand what's going on in your system. So you're off building something in this abstract world, but by being practical and having that data just be instinctual for you, you can then understand it better and know really where you should be spending your time. So that's kind of the developer side. From a business side, I think there are a few business people in here. You really start to think, at some level about, hey, I just need to start keeping more data. So that means, I need to go out and provision some hardware in order to make sure I have enough room to keep all of this. Oh, by the way, Hadoop can help you with that, and you can do it nice and cheap these days. And then for everyone, really, it's just, again, it gets back to this old notion of, I really have to be inquisitive. I have to be willing to ask questions. I have to be willing to learn. I have to be willing to experiment. And I think a lot of times we get stuck in this rut of, hey, I just got to get my code out. I've got to get this code out. I've got to get this code out. Take a step back, ask questions, be willing to fail at some of this stuff. It's very easy these days to just put up A/B tests and say, okay, well, I'm going to direct 1% of my web traffic to this new system that's simply running these experiments so that I can try this out, right? I was talking with somebody last night, and they were mentioning these yellow page sites or whatever, with the phone where you can call up and ask for directions. And they made the comment that this company was putting up this service not so that much that people could get directions for places, which was of course useful, but they really wanted all of this training data for all of their voice recognition tools. So that's a perfect example of somebody saying, I'm going to put up this experiment, pretty hardened experiment, but one that allows me to then dig into my data and get more information about what our users are doing. And that really, at the end of the day, is why I would put forth it's still all about the users. Well, with that, I will hand it over to Eric. And with that, I thank you for your time. And